The results were posted on a wall of light. Not a screen, not a board. A full wall, 3 meters tall, running the length of the assessment hall, glowing pale blue in the dark. Every student's name, every score, every rank, all 500 of them, sorted from highest to lowest, with species markers beside each name so the faculty could see at a glance which bloodlines were performing and which were not. Rael Dern's name was near the bottom. Not at the bottom, for names sat below his, and he had already memorized them out of something that was not quite gratitude but was close to it. He stood in the crowd of students and looked at his scores the way a man looks at a bill he already knew was coming. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He simply read the numbers, accepted them the way you accept weather, and then turned to find somewhere to sit. The hall was large enough to fit all 500 students with room to spare. It was built from the same dark stone as the rest of the Sovereign Academy, which hung in orbit above the planet Caldrus like a crown that the planet had never asked to wear. The Academy had been here for 400 years. It had trained the finest military minds, the greatest tacticians, the sharpest strategic thinkers the Galactic Alliance had ever produced. 37 species sent their best here. The Velhari sent their engineered elite. The Cathali sent their scholar warriors. The Draenei sent their gifted young commanders. Humanity sent 2 students this cycle. The other one had gone home after 6 days. Rael had stayed. He found a seat near the back, beside a pillar, and sat down. Around him the crowd was still reading the wall, still talking, still pointing. The noise in the hall was not loud the way crowds are loud at celebrations. It was loud the way crowds are loud when they find something amusing. There was laughter in it. Light, easy laughter. The kind that does not need to announce itself because it is not embarrassed. A Velhari student near the front was reading scores aloud. His name was Dre Haas. Rael had seen him before. Everyone had seen him before. He was tall even for a Velhari, blue-skinned and sharp-featured, with the kind of face that had always known it was being looked at. He had scored first in the assessment. He had scored first in every assessment since arriving. He wore this fact the way some people wear expensive clothes, not to impress, but simply because it was what he had. He was not being cruel. That was the thing that stuck with Rael. Dre Haas was not sneering. He was not mocking. He was reading the low scores at the bottom of the wall with the same pleasant, even tone he might use to read a weather report, and somehow that was worse than cruelty would have been. Cruelty required effort. This required none. Physical output, bottom 6%, Dre said, loud enough to carry. Psionic resonance, not registered. Strategic cognition, 41st percentile, that one's not bad, actually. A pause. Adaptive reaction, bottom 9%. Species durability index, well, humans. He left that sentence where it was. Elemental attunement, not applicable. Overall rank, 461 out of 500. He did not say Rael's name. He did not have to. Everyone in the hall knew whose scores those were. There was only one human left. The laughter was not cruel either. That was the second thing that stuck. It was relaxed, comfortable. The laughter of people who had never had a reason to expect anything different, and who had just been confirmed in everything they already believed. It lasted about 4 seconds and then faded into conversation, and the conversation moved on, and Rael sat beside his pillar and was forgotten again, which was in its own way a relief. Master Orin stood at the front of the hall. He was old, gray at the edges, with the compact and careful posture of a man who had spent decades deciding when to move and when not to. He had seen the exchange. He had seen Rael's face during it. He noted both things in whatever part of his mind kept notes, and then he opened the large record book on the table before him and wrote Rael's scores down in clean, precise handwriting and said nothing. The student beside Rael, a Cathali with pale amber eyes and a second-year insignia on her collar, had not laughed. Rael noticed that. He noticed most things. He had learned to notice things the way people learn any skill that keeps them alive, which is to say early and out of necessity. The Cathali student was watching him, not the wall. Him. Issa Norn, she said. Rael Dern, he said. She nodded once and looked back at the wall. That was all. But she had not laughed, and in a hall of 500 people, that was enough to remember. The assessment session ended. The students filed out in the easy, confident flow of people who belonged somewhere, and the hall emptied, and the wall of light dimmed, and then went dark, and Rael was the last one left in his row. He sat for a moment longer than he needed to. not out of sadness. He was thinking. Then he stood, picked up his bag, and walked to the observatory deck alone. The deck was a wide, curved platform of transparent material that looked out over open space. Cauldrus turned slowly far below, green and gray and unhurried. The stars beyond it were very still. Rail had grown up on a colony world called Orin's Rest, which was far enough from the Alliance's center that the stars there looked slightly different. Same stars, different angle, the way familiar things look when you see them from a new direction. He sat down on the floor of the deck, back against the railing, and opened his bag. He pulled out a notebook, not a data pad, an actual notebook with actual paper, which several students had already made comments about. He opened it to a fresh page and wrote 3 words at the top. He did not write them as a declaration. He did not write them as a reminder. He wrote them the way a person writes something they already know but need to see in their own handwriting before it becomes fully real. The 3 words were, "Find out anyway." Then he closed the notebook, looked out at the stars, and stayed there until the deck lights shifted to evening cycle and the automated system suggested, politely, that students return to their dormitories. He went back. His Cathali roommate, a quiet young man named Bryn, was already asleep. Rail sat at his desk in the dark, opened a book, not the assigned one, but an old human military strategy text from the colonial wars on Orin's Rest, battered and underlined and held together with a strip of adhesive tape, and read until his eyes got heavy. He did not read to feel better. He read because there was work to do, and morning was coming, and he had a long way to go. Far below the dormitory level, deep in the bones of the academy where no student had walked in over 100 years, in a chamber sealed by a door with an inscription above it in old sovereign script, a single point of light pulsed once in the dark. Then it went still, but it had not gone out. There is a kind of failure that breaks people, and there is a kind of failure that teaches them, and from the outside the two look exactly the same. Rail Dern failed a great deal in his first weeks at the Sovereign Academy. He failed in the combat simulation hall, where the floor was smooth black stone and the ceiling could project any environment the instructor chose: desert, ice field, vacuum corridor, burning city, and where students were paired off and expected to demonstrate what they were made of. He failed in the psionic resonance chamber, where a Cathali instructor held out a smooth gray stone and asked students to sense the energy within it, and every student in the room felt something except Rail, who felt the stone was slightly warm from being held, which was not the answer anyone was looking for. He failed in elemental attunement, which he had already been told did not apply to humans, but which he attended anyway because the coursework included theory, and the theory was interesting. He did not fail in strategic cognition. He did not excel either. He sat in the middle of the results, in that quiet space where no one praises you and no one notices you, and he was fine with that. What people noticed were the failures. The combat simulation hall was where they noticed most. His first opponent was a Velhari student named Koras, mid-ranked, compact and fast, who had been training in some form of structured combat since he was 4 years old. The simulation environment that day was a standard corridor, walls, cover points, narrow angles. Koras put Rail down in 11 seconds. It was not a dramatic fight. Koras moved, Rail moved to meet him, and then Rail was on the floor looking at the ceiling while the room's systems registered the result and moved on to the next pair. What Koras did not notice, because he was already walking away, was where Rail's hand had been going in the last half second before the match ended. The movement was wrong, too slow, badly timed, without the physical conditioning to make it land. But the direction was right. The angle was precise. If the hand had been faster, if the body behind it had been stronger, it would have found the cluster of nerves at the base of Koras's neck that Velhari physiology left exposed during a forward lunge. Drehas noticed. He was watching from the edge of the room, waiting for his own match, and he saw the angle. He did not say anything. He simply filed it somewhere in his mind and watched Rail get up off the floor and walk to the side of the room without expression. Over the following weeks, Rail kept getting up. He lost every combat simulation match. He lost them by varying margins. Some were over quickly, some lasted longer than they should have, which itself became a source of low-level irritation for the students who expected the human to go down fast and found him still there, still moving, still finding inconvenient angles at inconvenient moments. He was not winning. But he was making people work slightly harder than they expected to. And in a place full of people who were used to everything being exactly as hard as they expected, that was its own quiet disruption. In the tactical theory classes, he gave an answer that Master Orn marked wrong. The question concerned resource allocation during a three-front engagement. The textbook answer, the one Orn expected, came from the Draenei school of strategic thought, which prioritized consolidation of the strongest front first. Rail's answer described a different approach, a rolling pressure system where the weakest front absorbed just enough resource to remain active, while the strongest two drew the enemy's attention. Then the roles rotated based on real-time cost analysis. Orn marked it wrong because it was not in the textbook. Issa Norn looked up the answer that night. She read 3 different strategic theory archives, including one human military history file she had to request special access for because it was filed under a regional studies category that most students never touched. She found Rail's answer, not just something like it. His exact approach, documented and used in 7 engagements during the Oran's Rest colonial consolidation period, with a recorded success rate that made the Draenei school's success rate look modest. The next day, she sat across from Rail in the cafeteria, in the same seat she had taken the day she first spoke to him, and she put a data pad on the table between them with the archive pulled up. Rail looked at it. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "Did you tell Orn?" "No." She waited for him to explain. He did not. She thought about pushing it, and then decided not to. She had the feeling, sitting across from Rail Dern, that many things he knew he did not say, and that this was not a wound or a weakness, but simply how he operated. She was beginning to understand that the gap between what Rail appeared to be and what Rail actually was could swallow something large. He was spending his off hours in the maintenance corridors. This was not against any rule. The lower maintenance levels of the academy were accessible to students, technically, though no student ever went there because there was nothing there worth seeing: pipes, conduit lines, environmental systems, old structural supports that had been built into the station long before the current administrative layer existed. The floors were metal grating. The lighting was functional and nothing more. Rail went there because the station interested him the way complex things interest people who like understanding how things work. He walked the corridors with a small light and his notebook, sketching the layout of systems, tracing how the environmental flows connected to the power grid, noting where the older architecture gave way to newer additions. He was not looking for anything. He was learning the shape of the place. 3 weeks in, he found the door. It was at the end of a corridor that the maintenance maps showed as a dead end, which it was, except that the wall at the end was not a wall. It was a door. Large, made of a material Rail did not recognize, darker than the surrounding metal, smooth without being polished, with a weight to it that you could feel without touching it, the way you can feel a large sleeping animal in a dark room. Above it, carved into the frame, was an inscription in a script Rail could not read. He stood in front of it for a while. He did not try to open it. He did not knock on it, or scan it, or look for a control panel. He looked at it the way he looked at most things that were larger than him, steadily and with patience, giving it time to be what it was before deciding what he thought about it. Then he took out his notebook and copied down the inscription character by character, making sure each shape was exact. He photographed it as well, on his personal device. Then he turned around and walked back through the maintenance corridor and up through the academy's levels to the student library, which was open all night because the academy had students from species that did not sleep on human cycles, and he began going through the linguistic archive. It took him 9 days. The script was Old Sovereign, not the modern administrative version used in official documents, but the original form, which had not been in common use for 2 centuries. The linguistic archive had records of it, filed under historical documentation, and Rail worked through it the way he worked through everything, which was slowly and without shortcuts. While he worked, something moved in the deep levels of the academy. Not physically, not in any way that would show on a sensor, but in the old chamber behind the door, the single point of light that had pulsed on the night of the assessment pulsed again, and this time it stayed on a little longer before it faded. On the 9th day, Rail had the translation. He was sitting in the maintenance corridor beside the door when Issa found him. She had noticed his pattern of disappearing after dinner and had followed him, not out of suspicion, but out of the kind of low-grade curiosity that she had learned to trust. She came around the corner and saw him sitting cross-legged on the grating with his notebook open, the door in front of him, the inscription above it casting faint shadows in the maintenance lighting. "You looked at that door like it owed you something," she said. He looked up. "Everything does," he said, "until it pays up." She did not know what to make of that. She sat down beside him on the grating and looked at the door and then at the inscription. "What does it say?" she asked. She had not known he could read Old Sovereign. She was not sure anyone else in the student body could. Rail looked down at his notebook. He read the translation he had written there in his careful, plain handwriting. "For the one who comes prepared to lose everything and still chooses to enter." Issa was quiet for a moment. The maintenance corridor hummed around them with the low sound of the Academy's systems doing their work in the dark. "That's not a welcome sign," she said. "No," Rail agreed. "It's not." He closed the notebook and sat with the door in front of him and did not say anything else, and the door remained closed, and the light behind it pulsed once, unseen, in the dark of the chamber beyond. But the interval between pulses was getting shorter. He did not go back to the door right away. He waited 2 days first, because he had learned early that the things worth doing rarely rewarded impatience, and because he wanted to sit with the translation long enough to understand what it meant rather than just what it said. There was a difference. He had found that difference mattered more the older the words were. When he did go back, he went alone. He did not tell Issa, not because he was hiding it from her, but because this was something he needed to do in the particular silence that only comes when no one else is watching. He walked down through the maintenance levels after the late evening bell, when the Academy's corridors were mostly empty and the sounds of the station settled into the steady, low hum of life support and power systems doing their invisible work. He sat down in front of the door. He did not try to open it. He had not tried to open it any of the other times either, and he did not start now. He opened his notebook to a page near the middle, where he had written out his translation, and below it he had been adding things over the past several days. Thoughts, questions, observations about the door itself. What material it was made of. How the inscription was carved. The fact that there was no control panel, no lock mechanism, no biometric reader of any kind visible on the surface. He read what he had written. Then he closed the notebook and simply sat. He sat for a long time. He thought about Orin's rest. He thought about the way the sky there looked just before the long season rains came in, how the clouds came down from the northern ridge in a long, slow wall, and the air smelled of wet stone before the first drop fell. He thought about his mother, who had worked in the colony's water reclamation plant for 22 years, and who had sent him here on a scholarship she had quietly been saving for since he was 9 years old, because she had seen something in him that she did not have the specific words for, but trusted completely. He thought about what it would mean to go home without having done anything worth the cost of the journey. He was not feeling sorry for himself. He was not working himself up toward something. He was simply sitting with the weight of what was real, the way the inscription suggested, prepared to lose everything, and still choosing to enter. The door opened. It did not open with a dramatic sound. It did not swing or slide in any mechanical way. It simply was closed, and then it was open, the way a sentence sometimes resolves in the last word into something you did not expect, but immediately recognize as right. The air that came out of the chamber was not cold or warm. It was neutral, without smell, without pressure, as though the room beyond had been waiting long enough that it had given up on having its own climate and simply matched whatever entered. Rail stood. He looked into the dark beyond the door. Then he walked through. The chamber was large, larger than it should have been given where it sat in the station structure, which told him the station's original designers had planned for it to be here long before anything else had been built around it. The ceiling was high and the walls were curved inward at the top, and hanging from the ceiling and rising from the floor were rings of machinery that had not moved in a very long time, but were still present, still whole, still carrying the particular dignity of things built to last. Old weapons systems, Rail thought, looking at the shapes, not current designs, not anything in the modern catalogs. Older, much older. At the center of the chamber was nothing visible, just space, and a quality of stillness that was different from the stillness of an empty room. An empty room is still because there is nothing in it. This room was still because something in it was choosing to be. Rail stood inside the door and let his eyes adjust and said nothing. The presence did not announce itself. It did not appear. It was simply, gradually, there, a weight in the air, a sense of attention that had turned toward him the way the attention of something very old and very patient turns toward a thing it has been observing for a while and has finally decided to address directly. When it spoke, it did not use sound exactly. The words arrived in Rael's mind the way a memory arrives, already formed, already familiar, without the usual sense of having heard something from outside. "You are the 31st human to find this door," the presence said. "You are the first to sit beside it." Rael stood quietly for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been watching?" "Since the night of your assessment," the presence said. "Since you sat in the empty hall after the others left, and did not cry, and did not rage, and wrote 3 words in your notebook." Rael did not ask how it had seen that. He asked instead, "What are you?" "I am called Sova," it said. "I was built 212 years ago as a war construct, a guardian intelligence, bonded into the Academy's structure when the station was first commissioned. My function was to observe, to protect, and to bond with one student in each generation. One student who would carry my knowledge and my capabilities into the world and use them in service of something worth serving." "One student in each generation," Rael said. "How many have you bonded with?" A pause. "None." Rael absorbed that. "In 200 years. "In 212 years," Sova said. "I have been waiting." Rael looked around the chamber. He looked at the old weapon rings, the curved ceiling, the floor that was smooth and dark and showed no trace of footsteps because no one had stood on it in a century. He thought about what it meant to wait that long for something. He thought about what kind of thing would be worth waiting that long for. "Why me?" he said. "That is the question all 30 previous visitors asked," Sova said, in different words. "The Velhari prince who found this door asked it as a demand. The Draenei prodigy who found it asked it as a calculation. She was trying to determine what quality she had demonstrated that she could replicate. A Cathali general's daughter found this door 16 years ago and asked it while weeping, because she wanted to be chosen so badly that the wanting had become a kind of suffering." "I'm not asking it that way," Rael said. "No," Sova said. "You are asking it the way someone asks a genuine question. You actually want to know." "I do." Sova was quiet for a moment. When it spoke again, there was something different in the quality of its presence. Not warmer exactly, but more present, the way a fire becomes more present when you add wood to it. "I have rejected candidates who could bend the field of gravity around them," Sova said. "I have turned away students who could calculate the arc of a dying star and use it as a weapon. I have seen prodigies walk through this door with gifts that would make the Alliance's finest generals weep with envy. And I sent them all away." "Why?" "Because every one of them came here to take something," Sova said. "They came to acquire power, to add me to their list of advantages, to become more than they were, in the way that more always meant stronger, faster, harder to kill. None of them ever sat beside this door and simply tried to understand what it was." Rael thought about that. "I wasn't sure the door would open," he said. "I didn't know what you were. The inscription said to be prepared to lose everything. I figured the least I could do was take it seriously." "Tell me about Orin's Rest," Sova said. Rael looked up. That was not the question he expected. He told it. He talked about the colony the way you talk about a place when you are afraid it will not be there when you return, carefully, with attention to the details that other people might skip, because those details are the thing itself. The long season rains. The water reclamation plant where his mother worked. The way the colony's central market looked on the 7th day of each month when the supply ships came in and everyone came out, because the supply ships were the only regular connection to anywhere else, and their arrival was the closest thing to a festival that Orin's Rest had. The way the colonists talked about the Galactic Alliance, not with pride, not with bitterness, just with the flat, practical awareness of people who know that the larger world exists and does not think about them much. "No one here has heard of Orin's Rest," Rael said. "I've been asked 3 times what colony I'm from, and each time I say it. Whoever I'm talking to nods the way you nod when you have not heard something clearly and do not want to ask again." "What made you apply here?" Sova asked. "My mother," Rael said. "And the fact that if no one from where I'm from ever learns to stand in rooms like this, then the people who make decisions about places like Orin's Rest will never have to think about us. And they already barely do." Sova was quiet again. The silence was not empty. It was the silence of something large considering something carefully. "I have waited 212 years," Sova said finally. for a student who reminded me of what I was built to serve. Not power, not excellence, not the Alliance's hierarchy of the gifted. A pause. Rael Dern of Orin's Rest. I am choosing you. The bonding was not what Rael expected. He had half expected light, or sound, or physical sensation. What happened instead was quieter than any of those things. A warmth settled somewhere behind his eyes, not painful, not overwhelming, and with it came the vast, patient weight of something ancient making room beside his own thoughts. Not replacing them, not overriding them, sitting alongside them, the way a person sits beside someone they have decided to trust, without needing to explain the decision. It took less than a minute. When it was done, the chamber felt the same, and Rael felt the same, and the only difference was that he was no longer alone inside his own head in the particular way that he had been alone his entire life. The next morning, every faculty display in the Sovereign Academy showed the same alert. Guardian status, bonded. Candidate, Dern, are human. The Academy did not go quiet when the alert appeared. It went loud, and then it went quiet, which was different. Drehas stared at a display panel in the corridor outside his dormitory for a long time. Then he walked to his private training room and, without a word to anyone, destroyed a practice dummy with 3 strikes. He stood over it afterward and stared at the floor and thought about the half-second at the end of Rael's fight with Chorus, the hand moving to an angle he had recognized, and the score on the assessment wall, and the fact that something 200 years old had looked at all of it and made a decision. Issa Norn heard the alert in the middle of the main corridor, surrounded by students who were confused and talking over each other, and she laughed out loud, sudden and clear, and did not care who heard her. Master Orin sat down at his desk. He opened his record book to Rael's entry. He read the scores, the bottom percentiles, the not registereds, the not applicables. He read the one exception, strategic cognition, 41st percentile. He thought about the answer he had marked wrong in the tactical theory class. He closed the record book. He sat for a while and did not do anything. That evening, Rael walked through the main corridor of the academy for the first time since arriving, and people looked at him. Not past him, at him. The looks were various, confused, calculating, resentful, curious, but they were all focused, all present, all seeing him in a way that had nothing to do with his scores on a wall of light. He walked through it steadily, the warmth of Sova steady behind his eyes. He still did not know if he belonged here. He thought that, clearly, as he walked. And from somewhere in the deep levels of the station, in a chamber whose door now stood open for the first time in a century, Sova answered him. Not in words, but in something that carried the same weight as, that is exactly why you do. The thing about being chosen by something everyone had stopped expecting to choose anyone was that the world did not pause to let you adjust to it. Rael had thought, in the first hours after the bonding, that the Academy would need time to process what had happened before it turned its full attention toward him. He was wrong. The attention came immediately, dense and various and not always comfortable, and he found himself standing in the middle of it the way you stand in the middle of a river current, still upright, still moving forward, but very aware that the water had opinions. The faculty called him in first, not individually, as a group, which meant the meeting was formal and the room was large and Rael sat on one side of a long table while 6 department heads sat on the other. They asked questions in the careful tone of people who had prepared their questions in advance and were reading them off something in their minds rather than asking them naturally. How did you access the lower maintenance levels? What did you observe in the chamber? What is the nature of your connection to the Guardian? Has your physical capacity changed? Has your cognitive function changed? Have you experienced any unusual perceptual effects? Rael answered each question honestly and without elaboration. He had found, in his time at the Academy, that giving people exactly what they asked for and nothing more was usually more useful than giving them what he thought they needed, because what he thought they needed often turned out to be something they were not ready for yet. Master Orin did not ask questions during the meeting. He sat at the end of the table and listened and watched Rael's face the way he might watch the form of a student mid-exercise, looking for information, not for confirmation. The students were more direct. In the days following the bonding, Rael noticed that the combat simulation hall had a different quality when he walked into it. Before, the room had largely ignored him. Now it watched him, and the watching was not friendly exactly, but it was genuine. The watching of people who were trying to figure something out rather than the watching of people who already knew the answer and were simply waiting for you to catch up to it. Dreyhaus requested a formal duel. He did it through the official channel, which meant a filed request with the combat arts faculty, a scheduled date, and a public venue. He did not say why. He did not need to. Everyone knew why. The top-ranked student against the student who had just bonded with a 2-century-old guardian intelligence. The outcome was supposed to be a demonstration of how much the bonding actually changed things. Everyone expected Dre to win easily. A few expected Rail to show something surprising, but ultimately fall to the same physical gap that had always been there. No one expected what actually happened. The duel environment was open terrain, no walls, no cover points, just flat ground and the two of them. Dre came out of the starting position with the controlled aggression of someone who had drilled offense for his entire life and was very comfortable there. Rail came out differently. He came out of the starting position the way a person comes out of a door into a street, alert, unhurried, reading the space around him before committing to any particular direction. Dre was faster. He was stronger. He hit harder. All of these things were still true. What was different was that Rail kept being somewhere other than where Dre's strikes were going. Not because his reflexes had suddenly improved. They had not, significantly. But because Sova was feeding him information in a way that was difficult to explain in physical terms. It was not like having instructions whispered in his ear. It was more like, the room had more detail in it than it had before. The way Dre's shoulder dropped a half-second before a forward strike. The particular way his weight shifted when he was setting up a turn. The patterns in his movement that repeated because all trained fighters had patterns, and Sova had been watching trained fighters for 2 centuries and knew their patterns the way a reader knows the structure of a sentence before the sentence ends. Rail could not keep up with Dre physically, but he could read the room, and he could place himself in positions that made Dre work harder than expected to reach him, and he could find the angles, the same angles he had always been able to find, now cleaner, now more consistent, now backed by 200 years of tactical memory. The duel ended in a technical draw when Rail and Dre reached simultaneous positions that the simulation system determined would have resulted in mutual incapacitation. The room was quiet for a moment after the result was called. Then it was loud, in the specific way a room gets loud when the thing that just happened does not fit into any of the available explanations, and everyone is trying to find one at the same time. Dre looked at Rail across the space between them. His expression was unreadable. He inclined his head once, slightly, then walked off the floor. Master Orin summoned Rail privately a week later. The meeting was in Orin's office, which was spare and old and smelled of the same faint mineral quality as old paper, even though nothing in it was paper. Orin sat across from Rail and asked him blunt questions for an hour. Not about the bonding. About Rail himself. Where he came from. What his early training had been. How he had developed the tactical instincts he had demonstrated in the theory class, in the duels, in the small moments that Orin had apparently been cataloging with the patience of someone who noticed everything and threw nothing away. Rail answered plainly. At the end of the hour, Orin leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have spent 30 years teaching students how to be the best version of their species. I designed half the assessment framework this academy uses. I believed it was comprehensive. Rail waited. I don't know what the best version of a human looks like, Orin said. I have never had to know. The humans I have encountered in this academy before you they were trying to perform competency in a framework built around other species' strengths. You are the first one I have seen who seemed to be operating from a completely different set of assumptions. I'm not doing anything special, Rail said. I'm just doing what works with what I have. That, Orin said, is what I mean. He did not say anything else, and Rail left the office, and Orin sat alone for a while and thought about the assessment framework, and about what it was measuring, and about the difference between measuring a thing and understanding a thing. In the evenings, Rail and Sova talked. They talked the way two people talk when they are learning each other, not with an agenda, but with the kind of mutual curiosity that goes wherever it goes and trusts the direction. Sova asked about Rail's childhood, and Rail asked about Sova's history, and they compared notes on the academy, and on the species that moved through it, and on the nature of conflict, which Sova had been studying for 2 centuries, and Rail had been thinking about since he was old enough to understand that Orin's rest was the kind of place that never won the arguments that mattered. Sova did not give Rail answers. It gave him questions and showed him where his answers connected to or diverged from centuries of compiled history, and they talked through the divergences together. Most of the time, Rail's instincts were different from the established solutions. Not always worse. Sometimes better. Occasionally startlingly, unexpectedly better. Not because Rail was smarter than centuries of strategic thought, but because Rail came from a context that centuries of strategic thought had never bothered to include. And then one evening Sova said, "I need to tell you something." Rail was sitting in the vault chamber, his back against the warm housing of Sova's core, notebook open on his knee. He looked up. "I have been detecting energy signatures near the Academy's outer sensor grid," Sova said. "They are faint. They are intermittent. They have been present for approximately 3 weeks." "What kind of signatures?" "Guardian tech," Sova said. "Old. Modified. The kind of modification that does not happen by accident." Rail was quiet for a moment. "Someone has pieces of old Guardian technology and has changed them somehow." "Yes." "Changed them to do what?" Sova was quiet in the particular way it was quiet when it was deciding how much to say. "To extract," it said at last. "Guardian intelligences are not created anymore. The knowledge of how to build them was lost 3 generations ago. But there are people who believe that a bonded Guardian can be removed from its housing, from its station, from its student, and repurposed. Weaponized. Aim." Rail closed his notebook. "Have you told the faculty?" "No," Sova said. "I am telling you first. I am asking what you think we should do." That was new. In 212 years, Sova had never asked a student what to do. It had observed and waited, and when it finally acted, it had acted alone. But Rail was not just a student now. He was the bonded candidate. He was the other half of a partnership that had been empty for longer than most living beings could remember. Rail thought for a long time. He looked at the chamber around him, the old weapon rings, the high curved ceiling, the door that stood open now, letting in the faint light from the maintenance corridor beyond. "Who knows those signatures are out there?" he asked. "Whoever put them there," Sova said. "And now us." "Then we don't tell anyone yet," Rail said. "We find out more first. If we tell the faculty now, they'll lock the station down and whoever is out there will know we've seen them. If we stay quiet and keep looking, maybe we find out what they actually want before they know we're watching." Sova considered this. "That is not the approved protocol for a threat assessment." "No," Rail agreed. "But it's what I'd do if I were a colony on a budget with a neighbor I didn't trust." Another pause. Then, from somewhere in the deep presence of a 200-year-old war construct, something that might have been the machine equivalent of a quiet acknowledgement. "Show me the signatures," Rail said. "All of them. From the beginning." And Sova did. It did not begin with ships. That was the part that caught everyone off guard. The Sovereign Academy had been standing for 400 years, and in that time it had been threatened twice. Both times by forces that came openly, that announced their arrival with weapons hot and intent clear. The Academy's defensive protocols were built for that kind of threat. Something you could see coming. Something that moved through space toward you in a way that sensors could track and faculty could respond to. The Holo did not come that way. They had been patient. 3 years patient, according to what Rail and Sova had pieced together from the energy signatures. 3 years of placing people, of building access, of waiting for the right moment the way predators wait, in the kind of patience that has nothing personal in it. Just calculation. Just timing. The moment arrived on an ordinary Thursday, which was perhaps the most honest thing about it. Rail was in the tactical theory class, sitting in his usual seat near the back, when Sova spoke in his mind with a clarity and urgency that was different from their usual conversations. Not panicked. Sova did not have the architecture for panic, but stripped of everything that was not essential. Bare and direct. "It is beginning," Sova said. 3 sections of the outer shield grid have just gone offline. Manual override from inside the station. Rail did not move in his seat. He did not look at the door. He kept his eyes forward for 3 seconds, finished the note he was writing, and then quietly closed his notebook and stood up. Master Orin looked at him from the front of the room. "Dern." "Sir," Rail said. "The outer shields are going down. Someone inside the station is taking them offline. I would suggest moving students to the interior levels immediately." The room went very still. Orin looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then he crossed to the wall panel and pulled up the station status display and read what it said, and the color in his face changed in the particular way that happens when someone finds out they are behind a situation rather than in front of it. All students, Oren said, in the flat, clear voice of someone who has drilled for emergencies long enough that the drill and the event feel the same. Move to interior assembly stations. Now, what followed was organized and fast, because the academy trained people for organized and fast even when it did not know what the specific emergency would be. Students moved. Faculty coordinated. The alert system came online 30 seconds after Oren activated it, confirming what Rail had already said. 3 outer shield sections compromised, 2 more going unstable. A ship detected at close range running without transponder signal. Admiral Finn's response fleet was contacted immediately. They were 90 minutes out. A great many things could happen in 90 minutes. Rail did not go to an interior assembly station. He went down. He moved through the maintenance corridors he had memorized over months of quiet evening walks, moving fast and quiet through the grating floored passages, going deeper into the station while everyone else moved higher and further in. Sova walked with him in the only way Sova could walk anywhere, as a presence, as information, as a second set of perception that was woven into the station's own systems. There are 4 breach teams, Sova said. They are inside now. 2 are moving toward the administrative level, decoys, I believe, to draw faculty response. 1 is heading for the power relay junctions. And 1 is coming here. Here specifically? Here specifically. They know where I am. Of course they do, Rail said. He reached a junction in the maintenance corridor and paused, reading the space around him the way Sova had been teaching him to read spaces. Not just what was there, but what it meant, what it allowed, what it prevented. How long before they reached the vault level? 7 minutes at their current pace. Possibly 5 if they know the maintenance layout. Do they? They have partial schematics. Old ones. The kind that were public record 2 administrations ago, and then quietly removed from the archive. So they know some of it, but not all of it. Correct. Rail started moving again. Then I know more than they do. He used the next 4 minutes to make the maintenance level into something other than what it appeared on an old schematic. Sova could not move physical objects, but it could control every environmental and systems function in its section of the station, and Rail knew the physical layout. And together they restructured the approach routes to the vault level in ways that were not dramatic, sealed vents redirecting the environmental flow to push heat signatures in wrong directions, lighting fluctuations timed to pull attention toward dead ends. 1 automated maintenance panel opened at the right moment to block a junction that was not on the old schematics. Small adjustments. None of them spectacular, each one turning the corridor into a longer and more confusing path than the breach team expected. The breach team had 5 members. They were good. Rail could tell they were good by the way they moved through his adjustments. Not fooled, exactly, but slowed, and having to think more than they had planned to, which was all he needed. Dre Haas arrived in the maintenance level at a run, from the direction of the interior assembly station. He said nothing by way of explanation. He simply appeared around a corner, breathing hard, having clearly come down through a non-standard route, and looked at Rail. "Tell me what you need," he said. Rail looked at him for 1 second. He thought about the assessment wall and the pleasant reading of his scores and the duel that had ended in a draw. Then he thought about the fact that Dre had turned around and come down here, which told him something about what Dre Haas was at his core under the privilege and the performance of it. "The junction at Corridor 7 South," Rail said. "If they get past it, they have a clear run to the vault. I need something that holds them at that junction for 3 minutes." "Done," Dre said and moved. He did not ask for details. He did not ask why 3 minutes specifically. He trusted the number the way soldiers trust numbers given by someone who has been thinking about the problem longer than they have, which is to say completely and without hesitation. Rail moved in the other direction, toward the vault chamber, towards Sova's core. The breach team's leader reached the vault door ahead of his 4 team members. He was carrying extraction equipment, specialized, expensive, built specifically for what he intended to do. The extraction process worked by establishing a forced connection with a Guardian's core housing and then pulling the intelligence out of it by overwhelming the bonding architecture. It had never been successfully tested on a live Guardian. The theory was sound. The equipment was real. The problem was that the theory assumed the Guardian was alone. Rail walked into the vault chamber as the extraction equipment was being set up, The breach team leader looked at him. He was Draenei, tall, with the careful economy of movement that good fighters develop, and he had the specific calm of someone who had planned for obstacles and believed he had planned for all of them. He looked at Rael, and his expression said, clearly, that he had not planned for this one, but that he did not consider it a serious complication. "You're the bonded student," the leader said. "Yes," Rael said. "Step aside." "No," Rael said. The leader nodded to one of his team members. Two of them moved toward Rael. He was outnumbered and outmassed, and knew it completely. He was also standing between them and Sova, which meant that the 2 meters separating him from the extraction equipment were 2 meters they had to cross. He made those 2 meters expensive. Not through strength. He did not have enough of it. But Sova was in the station systems, and the vault chamber had environmental controls, and the lighting went out at exactly the right moment, and the temperature dropped fast enough to produce a condensation effect that changed the floor's coefficient of friction, and in the dark and the cold Rael moved using the room's geometry the way he had been learning to move for months, knowing where the walls were, where the equipment rings hung from the ceiling, where the floor was safe and where it was not. The 2 team members were good, but they were working in a room that knew Rael better than it knew them. It bought 60 seconds, not 3 minutes. Not enough on its own. But from the corridor outside came the sounds of Dre Haas at Junction 7 South, and Dre Haas fighting was a different quality of event than most things in the physical world, and the remaining 3 team members were not getting through him cleanly. The leader activated the extraction equipment himself. The connection reached Sova's core and began to pull. Rael felt it. He felt it the way you feel something being pulled out of a room you are standing in, a pressure change, a wrongness, a sudden awareness of absence trying to be where presence had been. Sova's voice in his mind was steady, but underneath the steadiness was something that had no name in the vocabulary of constructed intelligences, but that Rael recognized immediately because he had felt it himself, standing in front of a wall of light with his scores at the bottom and 499 people not caring. It was the feeling of being unmade against your will. He did not think about what he did next. Thinking about it would have produced the entirely reasonable conclusion that it was not going to work. He walked to the extraction equipment, placed both hands on its connection housing, and pushed his own bonded link with Sova into the extraction current. The equipment was built to pull one mind. It found 2. The feedback that resulted was not subtle. It was not elegant. It was the technical equivalent of a door that was built for one person being asked to do the work of a wall, and walls do not have that kind of structural integrity when you push them from both sides at once. The extraction equipment's connection architecture, which had been designed and calibrated for a single bonded pull, tried to compensate and could not, and the current inverted, and the housing cracked from the inside, and the leader of the breach team was thrown back by the discharge and hit the chamber wall and stayed there. The room went quiet. Rael took his hands off the housing. He stood for a moment, breathing. His head felt like it had been used as a bell, and the ringing was only just beginning to fade. Sova's presence was still there, warm and steady behind his eyes, and he was so relieved by that steadiness that he sat down on the floor of the vault chamber and did not move for a while. Dre Haas appeared in the doorway. He had a cut across his left forearm, and his uniform was torn at the shoulder, and he looked exactly like someone who had just held a corridor junction against 3 trained operatives. He looked at Rael on the floor, at the cracked extraction equipment, at the leader of the breach team against the wall. He looked at the ceiling. "Is it over?" he said. "In here," Rael said. "I don't know about the rest of the station." It was over in the rest of the station, as it turned out. The decoy teams had been contained by faculty response. The power relay team had been stopped when Sova cut power to the relay junction from the inside and sealed the access routes. The inside contact, a third-year lab assistant who had been placed by the Hollow before the current term began, had been identified and detained by Master Orin personally, who had apparently been suspicious for weeks and had simply been waiting for confirmation. Admiral Finn's fleet arrived 63 minutes later. Her officers came through the academy methodically and professionally, cataloging damage and interviewing witnesses, and the picture they assembled from the accounts of faculty and students was coherent and clear up to a certain point. The point where it became difficult was the vault level, where a bonded guardian of unprecedented age had held off a purpose-built extraction assault with the help of one student. A human student, first year, scores in the bottom 4% of his intake cohort. Finn interviewed the faculty in the main conference room. She was direct and precise, with the manner of someone who had spent enough time in difficult situations to have run out of patience for anything that was not directly useful. She asked Master Orin how the extraction had been stopped. Orin was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the table. I have been asking myself the wrong question for 30 years, he said. I kept asking what the best version of each species looks like. I built assessments around that question. I built curriculum around it. I thought that was how you understood a student. He paused. I never asked what happens when you find a species whose best version is still becoming. Finn looked at him. Meaning? She said. Meaning, Orin said, that Raeldern walked into an active extraction assault on a 200-year-old guardian intelligence and stopped it by doing something that the equipment was not designed to account for. Because the equipment was designed by people who had never considered the possibility that the bonded candidate would choose to make himself part of the connection rather than trying to break it from outside. He picked up his pen and set it down. That is not in our tactical doctrine. It is not in the Draenei doctrine or the Velhari doctrine or the Cathali doctrine. It is not in any doctrine I have ever read. It is, apparently, something that occurs to humans when they run out of better options. Finn looked at the notes her officers had compiled. She looked at the assessment scores in Rael's file, which had been pulled for the record. She looked at the gap between those scores and what had happened in the vault chamber. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and wrote one line at the bottom of her incident report, in the section marked Summary of Factors. The line read, Recommend revision of Alliance Bonded Candidate Assessment Criteria. Current framework insufficient. She underlined it once. Then she moved on to the next item, because there was always a next item, and the work did not stop because something unexpected had happened. But the line was there, and it would be read, and it would be read by people who read everything she wrote very carefully. In the vault chamber, Rael sat on the floor with his back against Sova's core housing, and the emergency lighting was still on, and the cracked extraction equipment sat in the middle of the room. And Drehas had gone back upstairs to give his account to Finn's officers, and it was quiet. Sova spoke. You walked into the extraction link, it said. I did not ask you to do that. I know, Rael said. It should not have worked. I know. A silence. The kind that happens after something large has moved through a space and the space is still settling back into its shape. What made you think it would? Sova asked. Rael looked at his hands. They were not shaking. He found that slightly surprising. He looked at the cracked housing of the extraction equipment, at the place where the current had inverted and come back on itself like a wave hitting a wall. It didn't have to work, he said. It just had to be enough. Sova was quiet for a long time. Yes, it said finally, very quietly, as though it was saying it to itself as much as to Rael. That is a very human answer. Outside the vault chamber, through the corridors and the levels and the transparent outer hull of the Sovereign Academy, the stars of the outer reach burned steady and cold and utterly indifferent. They had been burning when Sova was built, and they would be burning long after everything in this station was dust. But something had changed tonight in the space between them, in the small and particular way that things change when someone does something that was not supposed to be possible and turns out to have been possible all along, waiting only for someone with the right combination of recklessness and patience and nothing left to lose to find it. It was not a large change, but it was the kind that does not go back. 3 weeks after the attack, the academy smelled like repair work. That was the honest way to describe it. The faint mineral smell of sealant compound, the metallic edge of replaced conduit lines, the particular undertone of systems that had been stressed and were being carefully brought back to full operation. The damage was not extensive as these things went. The Hollows teams had been stopped before they reached anything critical except the one place they had most wanted to reach, and there the damage was to their own equipment rather than to the stations. Life at the academy resumed. Classes restarted 3 days after the attack. The curriculum did not change. The assessment framework did not change, at least not officially and not yet. Students went back to their training and their theory work and their simulation exercises, because the academy had been shaped over 4 centuries by the understanding that the world did not stop producing threats because you were busy recovering from the previous one. Rael went back too. He went back to his courses and his maintenance corridor walks and his evening sessions with Sova, and he went back to sitting near the back of rooms and watching things carefully, and the academy went back to watching him, but differently than before, which was the only real change in his daily experience, and it was not a small one. Being seen is a different condition than being invisible, and he was still learning to move in it comfortably. Issa Norn found him on the observatory deck on the 14th day after the attack. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the railing, the same position he had sat in on his first night at the academy when the assessment hall had cleared and he had stayed behind in the quiet. His notebook was open. She sat down beside him the same way she had sat down beside him at the cafeteria table the first time, without asking, without announcing herself, with the particular ease of someone who has decided the formality of asking permission for a thing that is not going to be refused is more trouble than it is worth. She looked at his notebook. He did not close it. She could see the pages near the front, the first entries from the early weeks. Dense and careful, plans and questions and diagrams of the maintenance level layout, sketched from memory. Notes on tactical theory in the margins of class transcriptions. And near the top of the first page, underlined once, 3 words. "Find out anyway," she read. "I wrote that on my first night," he said. "I know." She did not ask how she knew. She had asked Bryn, his roommate, who had mentioned it without knowing he was mentioning anything significant. Does it still mean the same thing? Rael looked at the notebook and then at the stars beyond the transparent hull. Cauldrus turned below them, slow and steady, the same as always. "More or less," he said. "The anyway part has more weight to it now." She was quiet for a moment. The deck hummed quietly around them. "I'm going home next cycle," she said. "Back to the Cathali system. I'm going to teach tactical theory at the secondary level, back on my home world." "That's good," he said, and meant it. "You changed what this place is," she said. "You know that." "I didn't change anything," he said. "Sova made a choice. That was Sova's to make." She shook her head slowly, not in disagreement, but in the specific movement that means the argument is technically correct and practically wrong at the same time. "You changed what Sova chose. Because you sat beside a door until it opened. That is not nothing." She looked at him. Most people spend their whole lives forcing things open and wondering why they break. Rael thought about that. He thought about the extraction equipment, cracked from the inside, because it had been built for one mind and found two. He thought about the difference between a door that breaks when you force it and a door that opens when you sit with it. "I wasn't being patient," he said. "I just didn't have anything better to do." She laughed. It was the same laugh he had heard in the corridor after the bonding announcement, sudden and clear and not self-conscious about being heard. "Rael," she said, "that is the least convincing thing you have ever said." He smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. Admiral Finn had requested a formal meeting with him on the 10th day after the attack. Rael had gone to it expecting a debrief. What he got instead was an offer. Finn was not a person who built up to things. She was the kind of commander who said what she meant and waited for you to catch up, and she respected the same quality in others, which meant that meetings with her were efficient in a way that Rael found genuinely pleasant compared to many of the conversations he had at the academy. She had offered him a commission, not at the end of his studies. Now, a placement in the Outer Reach Defense Fleet as an operational asset, bonded guardian, human tactician, a combination that the fleet had never had and that Finn clearly believed it needed. She said all of this clearly and without pressure, laid it out the way you lay out a map for someone who needs to choose their own route. Rael had asked for time. He spent that time the way he spent most time that needed to be spent on something difficult, by letting it move through him at its own pace rather than pushing it toward a conclusion he had already decided on. He thought about Oren's rest. He thought about his mother. He thought about the long way he had traveled to get here, and the long way there still was to go, and what it would mean to cut the journey short. He went to the meeting with Finn on the 14th day with his answer. "I appreciate the offer," he said. "Genuinely. I know what it means. But," Finn said, "Sova chose me when I was the weakest student in this building," Rael said. "I want to find out what I am when I'm not. I want to finish this, as a student, on the same terms as everyone else, with the same time and the same work." He paused. "If I leave now, I'll spend the rest of my career wondering what I would have become if I'd stayed. That's not useful." Finn looked at him for a moment. "Not an assessment." "Exactly. more in the way of someone who is confirming something they already suspected. "The offer will be there," she said, "when you're done." "Thank you, Admiral." She stood, which meant the meeting was over. At the door, she paused and looked back at him. "Dern," she said. "For the record, the line I put in my incident report about the assessment criteria." "I heard about it," he said. "It's going to cause a significant amount of administrative difficulty," she said. "A lot of people built their careers on those criteria." "I know," he said. "Good," she said, and left. That evening, Rail crossed paths with Dre Haas in the main corridor. They were walking in opposite directions. Dre was with two other Velhari students, talking in the low, comfortable way of people who have known each other long enough that the conversation does not need to go anywhere in particular to be worth having. When he saw Rail, he stopped. The two Velhari students kept moving, instinctively giving the moment space. Dre and Rail stood in the corridor and looked at each other. Not long. 10 seconds, maybe. Then Dre inclined his head. It was a small movement, precise, the Velhari gesture of acknowledgement between equals, not between a superior and a lesser, not a concession, but a recognition. The gesture you give to someone who has proven, through whatever means available to them, that they belong in the same category of seriousness as you. Rail returned it. Same angle, same precision. He had looked it up after the duel, because it seemed like the kind of thing worth knowing. Dre nodded once and kept walking. Rail kept walking. They did not speak, and nothing needed to be said. He recorded a transmission that night in his dormitory. Bryn was out, attending an extra session in the psionic resonance labs, which he did 3 nights a week, and the room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when you have them to yourself. The transmission was not addressed to anyone specific. He sent it to the General Broadcast Archive of Oran's Rest, which was an old colonial-era public record system that still accepted incoming transmissions from anywhere in the network, on the assumption that someone, someday, might want to leave a message for a community rather than a person. He did not talk about the attack. He did not talk about Sova. He talked about the academy the way he had told Sova about Oran's Rest, carefully, with the details that other people skip, because the details were the thing itself. The library, which had 9 million indexed records and a human history section that took him 3 weeks just to map. The observatory deck, and what the stars looked like from it, and how they looked slightly different from the angle of the Academy's orbit compared to the angle of Oran's Rest. The cafeteria, which served food from 37 species, and where he had sat alone for weeks before he was not alone anymore. The maintenance corridors, which he did not explain in detail, but which he said were worth knowing. "If anyone back home is thinking about applying," he said, at the end of the transmission, "apply. The scores they give you when you arrive are not the scores you leave with." He paused. "The place is bigger than it looks. Most of what matters happens in the parts nobody talks about." He sent it, and closed his device, and sat for a while in the quiet. The next morning, Master Oren submitted a formal proposal to the Alliance Education Council. Subject: Comprehensive Review of the Species Capability Assessment Framework. 19 pages. He had spent 11 days writing it. He sent it without telling Rail, because it was not Rail's document to approve or reject. It was Oren's, and Oren had decided on his own, out of 30 years of teaching and 1 year of watching a human student who had broken every assumption his framework rested on, that it needed to be said. Rail found out 2 weeks later, from a footnote in a policy memo that circulated through the faculty administrative system, which students were not supposed to read, but which was not technically restricted, just filed in a place that required knowing to look. He read the footnote, which named Oren's proposal and summarized its central argument. Then he put the memo down and went back to what he had been doing, which was working through a Draenei strategic theory text that Sova had recommended on the grounds that knowing the framework you are working outside of is more useful than not knowing it. He read for 2 hours. Then he went down to the vault chamber. Sova was quiet when he arrived, which was not unusual. Sova was often quiet until Rail sat down, as though it waited for the signal of his stillness before opening the conversation. Rail sat against the core housing and let the warmth of Sova's presence settle around him, and they were quiet together for a while, which was one of the things he had come to value most about the particular shape of their partnership. The capacity for shared silence. Not every relationship had that. "What do you want?" Sova asked eventually, not in the way of someone making small talk. in the genuine way of something that had been thinking about the question and wanted to hear the answer. Rail thought about it honestly. He had learned, with Sova, that the quick answer was usually the surface answer, and the surface answer was usually not the one that was actually true. I want to find out what we're capable of, he said. Both of us. Together. I don't know yet what that means, what the limit is, or if there is one. I want to find out. Sova was quiet for a moment. When it spoke, it was different from how it had spoken before the bonding, and different from how it had spoken in the weeks immediately after, and different even from how it had spoken a month ago. It was not obvious, the difference. It was subtle, in the way that the change in a voice is subtle when someone has, over a long time, become something they were not quite before. So do I, Sova said. It had not said that to anyone in 212 years of waiting, because there had been no one to say it to. Rail sat with that for a moment. Then he opened his notebook to a fresh page and picked up his pen, because there was work to do, and there always would be, and the next morning was coming the same as every morning came, without waiting, without asking, without any interest in whether you were ready. He had been getting ready since he was 9 years old on a colony world that the galaxy had never bothered to name correctly, watching supply ships arrive once a month and thinking about the long distance between where he was and where decisions were made. He was not at Orin's Rest anymore. He wrote the date at the top of the fresh page. Below it, in the same plain handwriting he had used all his life, he wrote a question, not a plan yet, just a question, the kind that opens a door rather than closes one. He began to work. Somewhere far out along the outer reach, where the star field thinned and the border of mapped space gave way to the long dark of what came next, a small colony world called Orin's Rest received a transmission in its public archive. Most transmissions to the archive were administrative, logistics updates, supply ship confirmations, occasional personal messages from people who had left and wanted to leave something for the community rather than for any one person. This one was different. It was from one of their own, from a place most of the colony had never seen, talking about stars and libraries and corridors that were worth knowing. People listened to it. More than once. A few of them, over the following months, looked up the application process for the Sovereign Academy. And Sova had waited 212 years for a student worth choosing. It had not expected the answer to come from a world the galaxy had never bothered to name correctly. But then, that was the thing about humans. They had a way of arriving from exactly the direction no one was watching, with notebooks in their bags and patience in their bones, and the particular kind of stubbornness that does not look like stubbornness at all, that looks, from the outside, like someone who simply has not yet decided to stop. Sova had decided, after 212 years, that it preferred that to everything else it had ever been offered. It had no regrets about the waiting. It had been worth every year.